Hey guys, tonight we begin with the final days of Queen Elizabeth, the first, the last Tudor monarch, and one of England. As most iconic rulers, she led her country through an age of flourishing art, decisive victories, and the forging of empire. But behind the crown and power was a woman whose death remains. One of history's most enigmatic royal endings. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who's joining. Yous from around the world now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background. Hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. By the winter of 602, Elizabeth I was approaching her 70th year, an age few reached in Tudor England. Her skin, once powdered into porcelain perfection, had begun to betray the fragility beneath. Her brilliant auburn wigs, once symbols of youthful power, now sat atop a body weathered by nearly half a century of rule. For 44 years, she had reigned alone. She had outlived rivals, buried suitors, and silenced every threat that rose against her. The once vibrant court, famous for its music, pageantry, and lively discourse, had grown hushed. The queen who had dazzled Europe with her wit and resolve was now wrapped in heavy silks, surrounded by shadows and silence. She no longer held council meetings, nor did she take her usual rides or walks in the gardens. But at her heart, and more precisely, at the ghost that haunted it, it wasn't just sadness. It was as if a deep, corrosive guilt had lodged itself in her soul. Some claimed she carried a locket containing his portrait. Others swore she muttered his name in the dead of night. Whether these tales were true or the invention of romantic courtiers, the effect was undeniable. What began as grief and withdrawal was now a public spectacle, her slow, tragic unraveling witnessed by nobles, courtiers, and servants alike. Physicians, summoned in increasing urgency, debated her symptoms. Some believed she suffered from a settling of humors, the vague Tudor diagnosis for mental or physical imbalance. Others suggested a cold distemper of the brain, but no one could agree on a cure, because no one could truly understand the cause. The silence was no longer just hers. It was England's, holding its breath. The once commanding sovereign who had outwitted kings and silenced dissenters now seemed adrift within her own palace. She would not speak of her condition. She remained upright, sometimes leaning against cushions, sometimes gripping the arms of her chair, but never fully reclining. Courtiers spoke in whispers. Nobles paced outside her door, anxious for news. And all the while, the air grew thick with unspoken fear, not just of losing their queen, but of what might come after. The realm had no clear heir, and though Elizabeth had long refused to name one, everyone suspected that James VI of Scotland would be chosen. But without her voice, without her seal, would her will be honored? It was as though she believed that surrendering to sleep would mean surrendering to death. Servants would later report how the queen stood silently in the corner of her room, cloaked in heavy black, unmoving for hours at a time. At night, they took turns watching her, unsure whether she was praying, mourning, or simply lost. In fact, she barely spoke at all. She answered questions with gestures or simple nods. Days passed without a full sentence leaving her lips. The queen who had once seemed untouchable now appeared human and deeply wounded. Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex. Their relationship had been volatile. Essex was dashing, ambitious, and impulsive. He flattered her, defied her, and begged for forgiveness, only to betray her again. In him, Elizabeth I saw both potential and peril. Despite his arrogance, she had favored him, elevating him to great influence within her court. But in time, his ambition turned dangerous. In 1601, he launched a desperate, ill-conceived rebellion to seize power. She had no choice. The crown could not tolerate treason, no matter how charming the traitor. Elizabeth signed the death warrant herself. And when he was beheaded in the Tower of London, something inside her unraveled. Her ladies-in-waiting, the closest and most trusted women in her life, were dismissed one by one from her room until she remained mostly alone. Even the few she allowed to stay, such as Lady Scrope, spoke only in soft, uncertain tones, unsure if their presence comforted or agitated her. But those around her saw it clearly. Her eyes had dulled, her laughter ceased, her energy faded. The Queen's heart, it seemed, had broken long before her body followed. The courtiers who had once competed for her affection now stepped more cautiously. They feared her moods, unsure how far her sorrow might drag her down. She stopped composing letters. She stopped approving documents. She even stopped attending chapel, a sign more shocking than any, given her deeply Protestant faith. And perhaps most telling of all, she refused music. But now, the iron will that had defined the Queen was beginning to crack. Not only was the Queen refusing food, she had also started to resist sleep altogether. For decades, Elizabeth I had been the embodiment of England itself. To die meant to relinquish control of her people, her image, and her power. Perhaps that was what she truly feared, the end of control. Physically, her health began to decline in ways subtle but certain. She developed a persistent cough. Her skin turned increasingly pale, and her frame seemed to shrink beneath her ornate gowns. The weight loss was alarming, yet she forbade any attempt to examine her too closely. Her vanity, even in sickness, remained intact. And through it all, one question loomed in every courtier's mind, but was rarely voiced aloud. Was this simply old age catching up to the Queen, or was something hidden festering beneath the surface? The answer, for now, remained locked behind her lips that once commanded empires, now barely moved at all. She would stand for hours on end, rooted to the same spot by her bed or by the window, as if the very act of lying down might bring death closer. When her legs could no longer support her, she would sit stiffly on cushions, eyes fixed on some invisible point, lips moving silently in prayer or thought. Though her mind was still sharp, those around her noticed something was shifting. Her appetite had waned. Her presence at court had grown sporadic. The fire that once radiated from her throne at Whitehall seemed dimmed. And with the turning of the year, rumors began to whisper through the tapestried halls of Richmond, palace rumors that their sovereign was fading. There had been loss, painful personal loss. The execution of Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, in 1601, had struck a deep blow. Though he had betrayed her, leading a failed rebellion, and attempting to seize power, Elizabeth the First had loved him in her own way. Some said it was motherly affection. Others whispered of something deeper. Regardless, watching him walk to the scaffold tore at her. She never truly recovered from that grief. In her final winter, she would spend long hours standing, refusing to sleep, refusing to eat. Servants noted that she rarely sat, and even less did she speak. When she did, her voice was thin, trailing like smoke. Sometimes she would gaze into the empty fireplace for hours, unmoving, as if staring into something far beyond it, something only she could see. The court began to prepare. Physicians offered tinctures, tonics, and prayers, but the Queen dismissed them all. Ministers gently urged her to rest, to speak, to name a successor. But the once commanding monarch only shook her head. Something weighed on her heart heavier than politics, heavier perhaps than the crown itself. As March approached, one truth began to settle among those closest to her. The reign of Elizabeth I was quietly, painfully coming to an end. As the days passed, the gloom that filled Elizabeth I's private chamber at Richmond Palace deepened. Her mind, they whispered, was slipping. It was during this time that her physicians began to observe something troubling. Some speculated that she feared death not as a woman, but as a ruler. To understand the weight pressing down on Elizabeth I in her final weeks, one must look not only at her body, From that moment forward, witnesses say the Queen began to change. Grief in that age was poorly understood. What we now recognize as depression might have been seen as melancholia, a spiritual imbalance rather than an emotional one. Elizabeth I had adored music all her life. She had sung, played instruments, and surrounded herself with composers and poets. Now she asked for silence. As March of 1603 drew near, the decline of Elizabeth I was no longer hidden. When her advisers pressed her for guidance on affairs of state, on the matter of succession, or on her own health, she turned away, retreating into herself, as if words had become too heavy to lift. At this time, her physical posture became symbolic of her mental state. She refused to lie down for hours, even days. The palace around her seemed to fall into a hush. England was no stranger to power struggles, and a queen's silence could turn into a nation's chaos. Among the many whispered theories about Elizabeth I's death, one stands out not because of its drama, but because of its slow, invisible nature. It wasn't a sword or poison goblet that may have killed her, but rather something far more insidious: her makeup. For decades, the Queen had adorned her face with a signature white mask of beauty, a thick layer of cosmetic powder known as Venetian ceruse. It was a fashion born from the aristocracy, designed to signal nobility, purity, and wealth. The mixture, however, contained two key ingredients: vinegar and white lead. Her courtiers now moved with urgency, though careful not to show panic. The Queen had stopped eating entirely. Her body already thin-seamed to retreat into itself, her bones visible beneath the ornate fabrics that once projected power and grace. She was wasting away, and yet no one could give her illness a name. And so, her physicians guessed. They used herbal tonics, tried warm compresses, and prayed. But Elizabeth would have none of it. She rejected all medicine. Her ministers watched helplessly as the one figure who had dominated their lives for decades began to vanish, not in a blaze, but like a candle slowly dying in its holder. For over 4 decades, she had stood as the embodiment of England. Her crown was not just a symbol of power. It was a living thing, fed by every decision she made, every speech she delivered, every threat she outwitted. But now, in the stillness of her chamber, that crown sat heavy and unclaimed. Ministers, especially Robert Cecil, the Secretary of State, pressed gently but firmly. England could not be left rudderless. Civil war was not a memory so distant as to be forgotten. And in a world where monarchs ruled by divine right, the death of a queen without clear succession was a recipe for chaos. The Queen refused to sleep not occasionally, but entirely. Her refusal wasn't rooted in stubbornness alone. It carried the weight of superstition and sorrow. In Tudor times, sleep was often viewed as a temporary death, a time when the soul drifted dangerously close to the beyond. And Elizabeth I, despite her formidable logic and intellect, may have believed that if she closed her eyes, she would never open them again. Days and nights blended into one endless vigil as she remained seated or standing in her chamber, eyes distant, spirit detached. Her breathing grew shallow. To many, it seemed that the Queen was terrified, not of death, but of what lay between her and death: rest. And the question of what came next loomed over the dying Queen like a storm. No one could help her. No one even knew what to call it. And so, they simply waited for the end, or a miracle. The Tudor line, so fiercely defended and glorified, was ending with her. And though she had maintained a lifetime of political control, she had long resisted naming a successor. Why? Perhaps because naming one meant acknowledging her own mortality, something she had stubbornly refused to do. Others claim she whispered, "I will have no rascal to succeed me," only to later accept the inevitable. But there is no record, no firm confirmation. The monarch who had delivered some of history's most memorable speeches would not speak her final decision. She would not allow incisions, nor bleedings. and perhaps that was more painful than death itself. He was male, Protestant, and had a legitimate claim through his great-grandmother Margaret Tudor. But his rise to the English throne would not be simple. Factions existed. Old grudges remained. Catholic claimants still lurked in the shadows. She even refused to undress, completely guarding her modesty to the very end. And through it all, she said almost nothing. Yes, lead, a metal we now know to be toxic even in small quantities. Illness was a matter of humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. The cold air in Richmond Palace, mixed with long hours of standing and fasting, may have led to a lung infection. A persistent cough, chills, and a slow slide into delirium align with such a theory. And without antibiotics, even a mild case of pneumonia was potentially fatal. Others speculate blood poisoning, possibly due to abscessed teeth or infected sores under her cosmetics. Dental hygiene was poor, and Elizabeth had already lost several teeth. Infections in the mouth, if left untreated, could enter the bloodstream, a deadly condition known today as septicemia. If those were imbalanced, disease followed. Treatments involved bleeding, herbal poultices, or purging the system. And yet none of these worked, because no one truly understood what was happening inside the Queen. Applied daily, layer upon layer, this lead-based makeup was absorbed through the skin. Over time, it could damage the nervous system, weaken the muscles, cloud the mind, and ultimately shorten the lifespan. She insisted on presenting the image of eternal youth, even as her body rebelled. Venetian ceruse was celebrated. It was even imported and used across Europe. The very thing that made Elizabeth I iconic may have also been one of the slowest, most cruel contributors to her downfall. In the end, the white mask that defined her public image may have also quietly hastened the fading of the woman beneath it. That makeup was not just vanity, it was armor. And like any armor, it came with weight in this case, a poisonous one. Some modern historians believe that long-term lead exposure may have contributed significantly to her physical and mental decline. The irritability, the confusion, the refusal to sleep or eat, even the depression that followed the death of Robert Devereux might have been magnified by chemical imbalance. The symptoms of lead poisoning read like a shadowed list of Elizabeth's final months: fatigue, depression, tremors, loss of appetite, cognitive decline, and skin deterioration. Her contemporaries noted that her teeth had blackened and fallen out. Her hair, once bright and flame red, had thinned and disappeared. Her skin beneath the paint was marked by sores and blemishes, signs hidden from the public behind pearl-studded wigs and powdered masks. And yet, the Queen remained committed to the illusion. But in her day, no one understood these dangers. By the second week of March 1603, the condition of Elizabeth I had become undeniable. Tudor medicine had no clear diagnostic tools. There were no thermometers, no microscopes, no concept of infection as we know it. Modern scholars have suggested that she may have succumbed to pneumonia, but none of these possibilities could be confirmed in her time. The silence around her became part of the illness. Her servants tiptoed. Her ladies wept in private. Though her body was failing, it wasn't illness alone that burdened Elizabeth I. It was the immense, inescapable weight of rule. Elizabeth had no children, no direct heir. The most obvious candidate was James VI of Scotland, son of Mary, Queen of Scots, whom Elizabeth had executed decades prior. As the Queen's strength faded, pressure mounted on her to make a formal declaration, but Elizabeth remained silent. Some say she gestured when asked if James should be king, perhaps a subtle nod, perhaps nothing at all. It is possible that in her mind, acknowledging a successor was equal to surrendering to admitting that her story, her dynasty, and her era were truly coming to a close. As March drew on and the hours grew colder, those attending Elizabeth I faced a peculiar and increasingly disturbing reality. There were moments when her attendants begged her to lie down, but she resisted with such force that they stopped asking. And so she sat sometimes hunched in her chair, other times leaning against the wall. She defied the limitations of her failing body. The swelling in her legs worsened. But still she would not lie in bed. Her servants tried to coax her with music. She turned it away. They brought warm drinks. She waved them off. She did not wish to be comforted nor convinced. It was as if she were standing watch over her own death, refusing to give it an invitation. Eventually, her strength began to betray her. She collapsed several times. On one occasion, she was found crumpled beside her chair, unwilling to cry out for help. After that, her ladies-in-waiting took turns staying close, hovering like ghosts of the court she had once commanded. Even they no longer spoke to her unless spoken to first. The atmosphere in the room was one of reverence, sorrow, and dread. When at last she agreed to lie in bed, it was not from peace, but from exhaustion. Her body had given out. She was placed beneath the covers gently, like a fragile relic being lowered into silk. It was the first time she had rested in days, and for many, it felt like the beginning of the end. The moment Elizabeth I allowed herself to be laid in bed, her chamber transformed. The silence grew heavier, more sacred. Those closest to her gathered advisors, ladies, physicians, each one aware that this was not just the death of a woman, but the closing of an age. The Tudor dynasty, which had ruled England for over a century, was ending with her final breath. The room was dim. Tapestries muffled footsteps. Candles flickered. Outside, the palace held its breath. No proclamations were issued. No bells tolled. Only whispers passed through the corridors of Richmond Palace. Those who had served her for decades now found themselves standing still, waiting for a word, a sign, a farewell that would never come. Despite the gravity of the moment, Elizabeth I said nothing. She had once been a queen of eloquence. Her words could rouse armies, silence parliaments, and charm foreign courts. But now, as she drifted between consciousness and sleep, not a single parting phrase escaped her lips, not to her ladies, not to her council, not even to the realm she had so long protected. Instead, she communicated through faint movements, slight nods, flickers of the eyes, the barest tremble of her hands. Some thought they saw her reach toward the crown resting nearby. Others claimed she gestured toward a portrait of James VI, the presumed successor. But there were no declarations, no final speech to echo through history. What did she see, lying there in silence? Perhaps visions from her reign. The young girl imprisoned by her sister, Mary the triumphant queen greeting the troops at Tilbury, the glittering court of poets and explorers, the fires of religious wars, the execution of Mary Queen of Scots, the death of the Earl of Essex. A life of power shadowed by solitude. Outside her chamber, preparations had already begun. Courtiers quietly packed their belongings. Ambassadors wrote coded letters to their kings. Messengers waited with horses ready. They all knew what came next. And yet, until the last moment, England remained a kingdom without a sovereign. For until her last breath, Elizabeth I was still queen. No one could take her place, not yet, not until she was gone. As the final hours of Elizabeth I's life unfolded, those who remained in her chamber stood like statues, silent, sorrowful, and uncertain. The queen no longer responded to touch or sound. Her breathing had grown shallow, irregular. Her skin, pale from age and illness, now took on an ashen hue. The fire in her had gone from a steady flame to a flickering ember. Lady Scrope, one of her most faithful attendants, refused to leave her side. She held the queen's hand and dabbed her brow with linen soaked in rose water. Others stood in the background, whispering prayers, some aloud, others in their hearts. There was no ritual for this. There had never been a monarch like her before. Outside, Richmond Palace was wrapped in a quiet anxiety. No proclamation had yet been made, and still no one dared call her death until the final breath passed. Messengers stood ready at the gates, prepared to ride to Scotland the moment it was confirmed, to deliver the news to James VI, the man who would be king. Inside, time seemed to warp. The minutes dragged like hours. No one dared speak of what would come next. Even Robert Cecil, the chief architect of the peaceful transition to the House of Stuart, stood still, his papers folded in his hand. His greatest political maneuver, uniting England and Scotland under one crown, was moments away, yet entirely dependent on a woman in her final moments. Then, just before dawn on March the 24th, 1603, it happened. No cry, no gasp, just silence. The room remained motionless for a full minute, as if all feared the breath might return. Then quietly, Lady Scrope covered the Queen's face with a linen cloth. It was over. Elizabeth I was dead. Her passing was not marked with fanfare, nor even with a priest's final rites. She had refused them all. The Virgin Queen, as she was so often called, had died alone, surrounded not by family or heirs, but by the weight of history. A monarch born of scandal, who ruled through storms and fire, now passed into legend with the same dignity she held in life, quiet, unbending, and ultimately unknowable. The death of Elizabeth I sent a chill across the kingdom, not because it was unexpected, but because of what it left behind. A throne without a voice, a court without direction, and a realm uncertain of its next heartbeat. She had been the only monarch many in England had ever known. Her presence was woven into the fabric of everyday life, her image stamped onto coin and conscience alike. Now that image was still. Immediately after her death, her body was left undisturbed. According to tradition, her ladies kept vigil beside her, whispering psalms through trembling lips. A single candle burned at her bedside. The cloth over her face did not conceal her identity. It preserved it, as though the nation needed one final moment to believe she was truly gone. But while grief settled inside the walls of Richmond, elsewhere wheels were already turning. Robert Cecil, perhaps the only man who truly understood the scale of this moment, stepped into motion. His secret correspondences with James VI of Scotland had prepared for this day. The couriers were sent riding with breathless urgency through muddy spring roads, carrying news that would transform two kingdoms. Meanwhile, back in London, the people waited. No bells rang. No mourning was declared. The court kept the death quiet for several hours, fearing unrest or opportunistic power plays. But word eventually seeped out first through servants, then to merchants and clergy. The Queen was gone, and with her, so too went the Tudors. There was no child, no sibling, no cousin raised at her side to step into her place. Elizabeth had left behind no personal heir, only the political hope that her choice, unspoken but widely assumed, would be honored. A privy council met in hushed tones. The moment was fragile. A kingdom needed direction, and fast. The fear of factionalism, of Catholic uprisings, of foreign meddling, all these haunted their thoughts. The bloodshed of past successions loomed like a shadow, yet the Queen's long silence had not stopped her government from preparing. Within hours of her death, the council declared that James VI of Scotland would become James I of England. A new dynasty began. But even as the nation turned toward the future, it did so in mourning for the woman who had shaped an age and left behind a silence no crown could fill. After the council announced the succession of James, the sixth now James, Eye of England, the focus shifted to the care of the Queen's body. Elizabeth I, who had guarded her image with almost obsessive control throughout her reign, could no longer maintain the illusion. The mask she had worn, both literal and symbolic, was beginning to fall away. In life, she had been meticulous about appearances. She rarely allowed herself to be seen without her full regalia, the white lead makeup, the elaborate gowns, the fiery wigs. Even in her final days, she kept her chamber darkened and denied most visitors. Vanity, yes, but also power. To appear weak was to risk everything in a court filled with ambition and knives. Now in death, her body told a different story. As her ladies gently prepared her for burial, they began to see what had long been hidden beneath layers of silk and powder. Her skin bore the signs of age and illness bruising, lesions, and the pale, unnatural hue from years of toxic cosmetics. Her hands, once adorned with rings and scepters, were thin and bony. Her hair, what little remained, had turned wispy and white. There was no denying it. Elizabeth I had been dying long before she allowed anyone to see it. And yet, in death, there was something profound about her humanity. She was no longer Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, or the untouchable monarch on coins and canvases. She was a woman who had carried a kingdom on her back for 4 decades and paid the price with her body. No embalming was done immediately. The tradition at the time was to delay the burial to allow time for national mourning and for proper ceremony. Her body lay in state, dressed one final time in royal robes, crown placed above her brow, orb and scepter at her side. For all the imperfections now visible, her people still came to pay respects, not just to the queen she had been, but to the person she had become. A woman of contradictions, powerful and alone, brilliant and burdened, fierce and fragile. The mask had slipped away, but what remained was not less regal, only more real. On April the 28th, 1603, more than a month after her death, the body of Elizabeth I was finally laid to rest. The delay had not been caused by negligence, but by reverence. England had lost its longest reigning monarch to date, and such a passing demanded a ceremony that would match the magnitude of her legacy. Her funeral procession began at Whitehall and moved slowly toward Westminster Abbey. The streets of London were lined with mourners, nobles, clergy, commoners. Thousands of faces turned toward the carriage that bore their queen one final time. Some wept, others stood in solemn silence. There were no cheers, no songs, only the tolling of bells and the shuffle of boots on stone. The coffin was draped in velvet and borne upon a massive hearse drawn by 4 horses. Above it sat an effigy of Elizabeth I, dressed in state robes, with crown, orb, and scepter, eyes open, face serene, as if still watching over her people. The image was so lifelike that many believed it to be her real body, propped upright in death. Behind the hearse marched an honor guard, followed by the nobles of her court, members of parliament, and ambassadors from foreign nations. Each step echoed the weight of transition. A queen was being buried, but an entire era was being mourned. At Westminster Abbey, she was interred in the vault beside her half-sister. Mary I, a symbolic reunion between 2 queens, once bitterly divided by religion and rivalry. On the tomb, the inscription reads, "Partners in throne and grave, here rest we 2 sisters, Elizabeth and Mary, in the hope of one resurrection." The irony was not lost on historians. In life, the sisters had been enemies. In death, they lay side by side. The funeral marked more than the end of a monarch. It marked the end of the Tudor dynasty. With Elizabeth gone, so too ended the lineage that had brought England out of the Wars of the Roses and into an age of exploration, cultural flourishing, and national pride. And as the Abbey's great doors closed behind her, an entire kingdom stood changed. The Elizabethan age was over. What came next would be shaped by a different hand and a different crown. Whose empire spanned much of Central America from around 250 to 900. CE worshipped cacao as a sacred plant bestowed by the gods. According to their mythology, cacao was a gift from the gods of creation, part of the very foundation of human life. This small, bitter bean from the jungle was thought to be a sacred substance capable of connecting mortals to the gods, the earth, and the afterlife. Hosting a guest meant serving cacao. Negotiating peace involved sharing a cacao drink. By the time Hernan Cortes and the Spanish conquistadors arrived in the early 1500s, cacao had become more than a spiritual symbol or luxury. It was an institution. In the Aztec Empire, it functioned as currency, medicine, and royal indulgence. When Spanish eyes first beheld the cacao bean, they didn't immediately recognize its worth. Towering temples, floating gardens, and bustling markets left them stunned. But among all the marvels, one ritual drew their attention again and again: the consumption of a dark, bitter drink made from crushed beans. They watched as Moctezuma II was served cup after cup of zocolatl in vessels of gold. They observed warriors, nobles, and priests treat the drink with reverence. Beneath this agricultural expansion lay the roots of a darker system, the transatlantic slave trade. Laborers were kidnapped, sold, and forced to toil on cacao and sugar plantations in brutal conditions. The sacred drink of ancient civilizations was now entangled in exploitation. What once symbolized divinity, balance, and royal ritual became a product of profit and pain. At first, they found the taste strange, unsweetened, and spicy, even unpleasant. Union of cacao and sugar, a pairing that delighted European palates, also became one of the driving forces behind one of history's most brutal systems, the transatlantic slave trade. As European demand for chocolate grew, yet they noticed its effects, the vitality it seemed to grant, the way it animated those who drank it, and its profound role in Aztec life. Yet that perception would soon change. The bitter drink of warriors and kings was about to cross the ocean, and with that voyage, it would be forever transformed. The Aztecs didn't grow cacao in the cool, dry climate of their capital, Tenochtitlan. Instead, they acquired it through trade or tribute. Conquered provinces in warmer southern regions were required to send cacao beans as payment. He brought cacao beans. He brought the techniques of grinding, mixing, and drinking them. And thus, chocolate entered Europe. At first, it remained a curiosity of the Spanish court, an exotic luxury from the New World. Monasteries prepared it in the traditional manner for the noble class. But the European palate was different. Over time, the fiery chili and maize were replaced with a new ingredient, sugar. Tons of beans flowed into imperial coffers, stored in granaries like modern banks. What had once been a sacred and powerful potion became seductive and luxurious. In Spain and soon across Europe, chocolate became the drink of aristocrats. Royals demanded it at their tables. It was still consumed as a drink, often hot, but the ritual gave way to elegance. Recipes replaced ceremonies. The power once held by the gods and warriors now belonged to courtiers and kings. And yet, as chocolate delighted the European elite, it carried a deeper bitterness, not of taste, but of consequence. Each bean had value. 10 beans could buy a small rabbit. 100 might buy a turkey. Servants were paid in cacao, and debts were settled with it. To counterfeit a cacao bean, to hollow one out and fill it with dirt, was a serious crime. To offer cacao was to recognize shared humanity, an unspoken bond of respect and harmony. Even within noble homes, the act of drinking cacao was ceremonial. Beautifully painted cups marked with glyphs identified not only the owner, but the ritual significance of the drink. These weren't merely utensils, they were heirlooms, crafted with intention and reverence. This reverence for cacao helped shape Maya identity. It was celebrated, cherished, and honored as a bridge between realms. In a world defined by celestial cycles and sacred order, cacao was a drink that helped keep the universe in balance. In every major Maya city, from Tikal to Copan, cacao was present at the most important moments of life. When rulers were crowned, cacao was poured. When marriages were sealed, it was drunk by both bride and groom. Known as zocolatl, it was revered as a warrior's drink consumed by nobles, priests, and military leaders, never by commoners. Prepared with water, chili, and maize, It was believed to energize the body and sharpen the mind before battle. Emperor Moctezuma II was said to consume as many as 50 cups a day, believing it to enhance virility and strength. Cacao was also central to religious rites. Offerings were made to Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god who, according to legend, gave cacao to humans after stealing it from paradise. To drink cacao properly was to honor the gods. In Aztec culture, cacao represented wealth, war, worship, and royalty. It was a seed of power earned, traded, and deeply respected. And when the dead were laid to rest, vessels of cacao accompanied them into the tomb offerings meant to nourish their souls in the next world. Cacao was commonly consumed during religious ceremonies, often by the priestly and elite classes. These drinks were not sweet, nor were they taken casually. They were blended with chili peppers, maize, vanilla, and sometimes even blood, a powerful combination believed to invigorate the spirit and induce visions. Drinking cacao could bring one closer to the divine, opening the mind to prophecy or sacred insight. Maya beliefs also extended to the cacao tree itself. With its curved branches and brightly colored pods, it symbolized life, fertility, and abundance. In art, cacao appeared alongside gods and ancestral spirits. Painted ceramics and carved stele depicted kings offering cacao to deities or gods themselves, emerging from the pods as though born of divine fruit. The Popol Vuh, a sacred Maya text, describes the gods forming humans from maize and cacao, binding them to the natural world. Cacao was reserved for important moments. Priests offered it during religious ceremonies, and nobles drank it during elaborate feasts. It was believed to invigorate the spirit and open a gateway to the divine. Served cold and mixed with chili spices or cornmeal, the cacao drink was rich, intense, and energizing. Often it was poured from vessel to vessel to create a frothy foam, a sign of prestige and quality. But cacao's value reached deeper than ritual. Maya markets used cacao beans as currency. A few beans could buy a tamale. 100 could buy a turkey. People stored them like money, traded them with care, and even crafted counterfeit versions from clay. To the Maya, chocolate wasn't a treat. It was life, power, wealth, and worship, all in one, a drink of the gods, flowing through the veins of kings and priests, marking the beginning of one of the most remarkable culinary journeys in human history. Among the Maya, cacao was more than a beverage. It was a living symbol of divine order, woven into the fabric of daily life and cosmic belief. But cacao's influence wasn't confined to temples and tombs. It was a staple of the social world. Centuries after the Maya, another mighty civilization would rise and elevate cacao further, the Aztecs. In Aztec society, cacao was as valuable as gold, yet its worth transcended economics. But this sacred being was soon to encounter a force unlike any it had before European conquest. When Hernan Cortes and his band of conquistadors first arrived in the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan in 1519, they stepped into a world both dazzling and unfamiliar. Once conquest was complete, Cortes brought more than gold and silver back to Spain. Sugar changed everything. With sweetness, the bitter warrior's drink became a fashionable indulgence. To meet growing European demand for cacao and sugar, colonial plantations spread across the tropics. By the 17th century, chocolate had evolved from a sacred Mesoamerican ritual to a fashionable European delicacy. But behind this sweet transformation lay a growing darkness. So did the need for raw cacao. The lush equatorial regions of South America, Central America, and the Caribbean offered the perfect climate to grow the cacao tree. But harvesting it was labor-intensive. Cacao pods had to be picked by hand, split open, and the beans carefully fermented, dried, and roasted. The same was true for sugarcane, another demanding crop. To maximize profit, colonial powers turned to slavery. For centuries, chocolate remained a liquid luxury, poured in royal courts and whispered about in salons. This process, now known as Dutching, gave birth to Dutch cocoa and paved the way for a new chapter: solid chocolate. Prices dropped, texture improved, and chocolate entered shops, factories, and homes across Europe and the United States. What began as a sacred ritual among ancient Mesoamerican peoples had transformed into an empire of factories, advertisements, and mass consumption. In the United States, this transformation took a uniquely American turn with the rise of Milton Hershey. In the late 1800s, Hershey applied assembly line techniques to chocolate. What once carried divine meaning and ceremonial weight had become for many just another snack delicious, convenient, and sold by the millions. This approach preserves the unique flavors of specific regions: the fruitiness of Madagascar, the floral notes of Ecuador, the earthy richness of Peru. In regions of Mexico and Guatemala, ancient recipes returned spiced, unsweetened drinks served in traditional vessels, celebrating the cacao bean as it once was. This movement is still growing. It seeks not just to reclaim the taste of chocolate, but its soul, the connection to land, labor, culture, and ceremony. Today, as you unwrap a bar or sip a cup, you might taste not only sweetness, but memory. Beneath the cream and sugar lies a lineage of kings and farmers, gods and conquerors, rituals and resistance. The story of chocolate is still being written, one bite at a time. It turned out that chocolate, like wine, had terroir. The place it was grown mattered. But this revival wasn't only about taste, it was also about justice. Documentaries and investigations revealed the reality behind many cacao farms: low pay, unsafe conditions, and child labor. In response, craft chocolate makers began forging direct relationships with farmers, paying fair prices, and investing in communities. Certifications like Fair Trade, Direct Trade, and Rainforest Alliance emerged to guide consumers toward more ethical choices. But in recent decades, a new movement has begun to stir: a rediscovery of chocolate tea's roots and a return to the bean. The craft chocolate movement began in earnest in the early 2000s. Inspired by the slow food movement and artisan traditions, chocolatiers across the world began to ask new questions. Asterisk, where does our chocolate come from? Who grows it? What does it taste like before it's buried beneath sugar and additives? These questions led back to the bean, to the source. His factory in Pennsylvania made milk chocolate affordable for the everyday consumer. By 1900, the Hershey bar was born. It marked the start of a new romance, an American love affair with chocolate that would only grow stronger. Companies like Cadbury, Nestle, and Hershey would soon industrialize chocolate on an unprecedented scale. Packaging became colorful and inviting. It appeared in cookbooks, school lunches, and holiday rituals. Valentine's Day, Halloween, Easter each embraced chocolate as their own. Meanwhile, global production surged. West Africa, particularly Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire, surpassed Latin America in cacao cultivation. Ironically, the same regions once brutalized by colonialism were now producing more than 70% of the world as cacao. Yet beneath this modern economy, old patterns remained. Labor abuses, poverty wages, and even child labor persisted. And still, the world's appetite for chocolate continued to grow. Advertising told stories of wonder, joy, and childhood dreams. In Switzerland, it became a point of national pride, with iconic brands like Toblerone and Lindt. In Mexico, chocolate returned to its roots, used in dishes like mole, where bitter met savory in ancient harmony. Global chocolate culture had become a paradox, both universal and deeply personal. A product once born of ceremony, then transformed by conquest and industry, had been embraced in 1,000 ways across continents and cultures. From the Andes to Antwerp, from Ghana to Geneva, chocolate had become part of the human story. Few paused to wonder where it came from, but every bite carried with it the layered echoes of time, flavors of devotion. Exploitation, sweetness, and sorrow all swirled together in one familiar taste. In making chocolate sweet, accessible, and solid, something of its origins faded. The divine drink of gods had become a common snack. Delicious, yes, but stripped of its ancient significance and ritual. Still, a new chapter had begun, one where chocolate would find a place in hearts and hands around the world. In 1847, the British company Fry and Sons took the next step. They combined cacao powder, cacao butter, and sugar to create the world's first modern chocolate bar. It was smooth, moldable, and portable, a delicacy, no longer confined to cups. For the first time, chocolate could be held in the hand. Then came the Swiss. In the 1870s, Daniel Peter introduced milk chocolate by adding condensed milk to the mixture. The result was creamier, sweeter, and easier on the palate. His friend and rival, Rodolphe Lindt, soon revolutionized the texture with his invention of the conching machine. By slowly churning the chocolate for hours, it became velvety and smooth, the texture we now associate with quality chocolate. But as the world entered the Industrial Revolution, chocolate was poised for another transformation, one that would change its form, its audience, and its role in everyday life forever. The early 1800s brought a wave of inventions. Mechanization reshaped how food was grown, processed, and consumed. In 1828, a Dutch chemist named Conrad Johannes van Houten changed chocolate history. Using a hydraulic press, he extracted much of the natural fat cacao butter from roasted cacao beans. What remained was a dry cake, easily ground into fine powder. This cocoa powder could be dissolved more easily, mixed with sugar more efficiently, and produced at a lower cost. The Portuguese, Spanish, French, Dutch, and British all participated in building plantation economies that were fueled by the backs and hands of enslaved labor. Millions of Africans were captured, shackled, and shipped across the Atlantic. They were forced to labor under brutal, punishing conditions on plantations in Brazil, the Caribbean, and later West Africa. Many would spend their entire lives cultivating cacao and sugar, never once tasting the sweet confections their toil created. The human cost was staggering. In pursuit of chocolate and sugar, families were torn apart, cultures were suppressed, and entire generations bore the weight of loss and suffering. Yet in the refined drawing rooms of London, Paris, and Madrid, aristocrats sipped hot chocolate from delicate porcelain cups, unaware or uninterested in the pain behind the beans. The commodification of cacao marked a significant shift. It was no longer a sacred offering to gods or kings. It was now a global product, something to be taxed, traded, and consumed. It had become a commodity, its journey no longer a spiritual passage, but one of commerce and colonialism. And as the industrial age loomed, demand for cacao would only increase. What had begun as a divine ritual, a drink crafted with reverence and connection, had now become entangled with empire and exploitation. The taste, once rich with celestial meaning, now lingered with a deeper bitterness, one not born of flavor, but of injustice, labor, and bloodshed. Still, the allure of chocolate continued to grow. Its association with pleasure, comfort, and luxury only deepened. As sweetness melted across European tongues, the bitter origins of that delight were buried beneath layers of cream, sugar, and silence. The story of chocolate was no longer only about taste or ceremony. It was now about power, commerce, and the people lost in its shadows. The result was a lighter, smoother chocolate, more accessible and easier to enjoy. These innovations shifted chocolate from a luxury to a mass-market product. By the dawn of the 20th century, chocolate had become more than a sweet indulgence. It had become a symbol, a cultural icon, and a booming global industry. Chocolate was no longer just a product. It was a symbol of comfort, nostalgia, and joy. Soldiers carried it in rations during wartime. Children traded it like treasure on playgrounds. In Japan, chocolate became a refined art gifted in elaborate rituals and crafted into tiny edible masterpieces. In the whirlwind of industrial growth and global expansion, chocolate's ancient origins were largely forgotten. Unlike mass-produced chocolate, which often blends beans from multiple countries, craft chocolate emphasizes single-origin cacao. Meanwhile, chefs and historians work to revive the original spirit of cacao. Traditional drinks made with cacao, chili, and maize regained popularity. Indigenous communities, rich in heritage and resilience, shared recipes passed down for generations, reminding the world that chocolate was not invented in a factory, but in a forest. This quiet renaissance brought with it museums, books, and culinary tours that celebrated chocolate not merely as candy, but as culture. A culture steeped in struggle, in ritual, in reverence. As more people began to see chocolate through this lens, it emerged not just as a flavor, but as a story and narrative laced with memory, migration, and meaning. Much of the modern chocolate industry still relies on the labor of impoverished farmers, many of whom have never once tasted the final product their hands helped create. It comforts the grieving, delights the young, and marks the moments we hold dear. That might be chocolate's greatest legacy, not just its enduring flavor, but its ability to evolve, to adapt, and to survive the rise and fall of civilizations. From sacred ritual to factory recipe, from seed to symbol, chocolate has always meant more than it seems. In the end, it is not merely a treat, it is a story. One that even now, in kitchens, in fields, and in hearts, we are still writing. Despite ethical sourcing initiatives and awareness campaigns, the industry grapples with ongoing issues. Deforestation, underpayment, and child labor remain persistent challenges. Chocolate is also the story of forgotten voices, the indigenous peoples who first revered cacao as sacred. Their traditions, once silenced by colonization, are only now being rediscovered and acknowledged. Each time we bite into a truffle or sip from a cup of cocoa, we engage, whether we realize it or not, with this deep, often bittersweet history. The world had changed chocolate, reshaped it, refined it, and in some ways, exploited it. But chocolate, in its essence, had never changed. At celebrations, tucked into vending machines, layered into pastries, and delicately crafted in gourmet kitchens, it is a symbol of love, of comfort, of indulgence, and luxury. But beneath its silky surface lies a history that's anything but simple. It is a tale of divine gifts and empires, of joy and exploitation, of sacred ritual and modern reinvention. Chocolate, perhaps more than any other food, reflects the evolution of civilization. It is a mirror held up to humanity, revealing both brilliance and blindness. It remained the fruit of a tree, grown patiently by hand, prepared with intention, and shared with meaning. It has bore witness to our triumphs and transgressions. From wartime rations to Valentine's Day offerings, it has adapted, endured, and grown ever sweeter in collective memory. Its legacy is layered. On one side, chocolate represents ingenuity, resilience, and cultural fusion. It is an embodiment of the beauty born when ingredients, techniques, and traditions from across continents come together. It has inspired poetry, science, and culinary artistry, from the precision of tempering to the depth of flavor balancing. And for those who cared to listen, chocolate once again began to speak not just in sweetness, but in memory. In the gentle unfolding of flavor, there lay echoes of ancient forests and sacred ceremonies. In its warmth, a whisper of fireside gatherings, of elders passing down wisdom. Chocolate had survived conquest, commodification, and industrialization. Yet it still bore its soul to those willing to pause. Today, chocolate is everywhere. From the sacred ceremonies of the Maya to the bitter brews of Aztec warriors. From the hands of enslaved laborers on colonial plantations to the gilt-edged salons of European nobility, chocolate has journeyed alongside us. On the other side, however, chocolate holds a deeper, often shadowed truth. And yet, chocolate continues to unite. Across languages, across borders, across belief systems, it speaks in joy. And so the Cherokee fight for justice ended not with a gavel, but with the sound of soldiers preparing to march. In the spring of 1838, under orders from President Martin Van Buren, thousands of federal troops and state militias descended upon Cherokee lands. The time for negotiation was over. The Treaty of New Echota, signed by a minority of Cherokee without the consent of their nation, had been ratified by Congress. Removal was now official policy, and the military was sent to carry it out by force. Across Georgia, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Alabama, Cherokee families were torn from their homes with little warning. Soldiers arrived at farms and cabins with bayonets and orders. Families were given only moments to gather belongings, sometimes nothing more than the clothes on their backs. Their homes were looted and burned. Crops were left to rot in the fields. Churches, schools, and burial grounds all abandoned. More than 16,000 Cherokee were rounded up and placed in military stockades. These makeshift camps were overcrowded and unsanitary, with little food, dirty water, and no shelter from the elements. Disease spread rapidly. Measles, dysentery, and whooping cough took a heavy toll even before the march began. Some groups were moved immediately under armed guard. Others, held in the sweltering summer heat, were forced to wait until autumn, when travel conditions were considered more favorable. But cold rains, early snow, and inadequate supplies would make the journey even more deadly. The Cherokee called the route Nunadal Tsuni, the trail where they cried. Roughly 1,200 miles stretched between their homes and the so-called Indian Territory. The march was slow, harsh, and humiliating. They walked through mud and snow, across frozen rivers, over mountains and prairies. The elderly collapsed. Children died in their mothers' arms. Entire families vanished along the trail, buried in shallow, unmarked graves by the roadside. Some tried to maintain dignity singing prayers, carrying sacred objects, recording names of the lost, but the weight of grief was unbearable. Hunger gnawed at their strength. Winter pierced their thin clothing. Guards showed little mercy. By the time the last group arrived in what is now Oklahoma in early 1839, it's estimated that over 4,000 Cherokee had died, nearly a quarter of their entire population. This was not simply a relocation, it was a death march, a forced erasure of identity, home, and hope. When the last group of Cherokee reached Indian Territory in March of 1839, the journey was over, but the suffering was not. The losses endured along the Trail of Tears extended far beyond the 4,000 lives claimed by disease, exposure, and starvation. What died on that trail was more than people. It was a way of life, a spiritual connection to land, and the cultural continuity of an entire nation. The trauma echoed through generations. Survivors arrived weakened, broken, and grieving. They had lost elders who carried traditional knowledge, children who had represented future hope, leaders who had defended their people with all the strength they had. There were no ceremonies for the dead, no time for mourning. The land they had been forced to settle was unfamiliar and often hostile. The promises made by the U.S. government of protection, supplies, and fertile land were inconsistently honored or ignored altogether. The physical wounds were matched by emotional ones. The Cherokee had been a proud nation with schools, printing presses, and a constitution. They had trusted the legal system, believing that law would protect them, but their trust had been betrayed, their justice denied, their rights erased. Among the survivors, divisions deepened. The treaty party, those who had signed the Treaty of New Echota, were viewed by many as traitors. In June of 1839, just months after the relocation, Major Ridge, John Ridge, and Elias Bowdenet were assassinated by fellow Cherokee in a wave of retribution. The unity of the nation, already battered by removal, now fractured further under the weight of internal conflict. And yet, even amidst devastation, the Cherokee endured. They rebuilt schools. They reestablished their government. They began printing newspapers again. They held on to their language, their stories, their faith. The resilience that had once carried them through legal courts and diplomatic struggles now became the foundation of survival. Still, the scars of removal ran deep, and they remain today. The Trail of Tears is not just a chapter in a history book. It's a living memory, carried in families, in oral traditions, and in the soul of a people who were forced to leave everything behind. And in that memory, there is sorrow, but also strength. While the Cherokee Trail of Tears is the most widely remembered, it was not the only forced removal. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 targeted multiple native nations, each with their own languages, traditions, and lands. And each endured their own version of exile, suffering, and loss. The Choctaw were the first to be removed, beginning in 1831. Thousands of Choctaw were forced from their homelands in Mississippi and Alabama. Most traveled on foot, without wagons or adequate supplies. As they marched through freezing rains and swollen rivers, hundreds died. A Choctaw chief later called it a trail of tears and death, a phrase that would echo in history. The Creek Nation, once powerful in the southeast, was next. After years of broken treaties and violent clashes with settlers and militias, they too were rounded up and driven westward. In 1836, over 15,000 Creek were removed, many in chains. Thousands perished along the way, while others were sold into slavery or scattered from their kin. The Chickasaw negotiated payment for their lands before removal, but their journey was no less brutal. Delays in receiving compensation left them without resources, and hundreds died from disease and starvation during the move west. The Seminole of Florida resisted most fiercely. From 1835 to 1842, they waged guerrilla war against U.S. forces in the swamps and forests. Leaders like Osceola became symbols of resistance. But even the Seminole could not withstand the weight of U.S. military power forever. Thousands were captured or killed. Others were forcibly marched to Indian territory, while a small group fled deep into the Everglades, where their descendants remain today. In all, over 100,000 Native Americans from multiple nations were displaced during the removal era. The government called it policy. The settlers called it progress. But for Native peoples, it was catastrophe. Each nation's trail was different, but all shared the same themes: betrayal, suffering, and loss. Sacred homelands were stripped away. Cultural centers were shattered. The bonds of community, family, and memory were stretched to the brink. And yet, these nations carried their songs, their languages, and their spirit with them into a new land that did not welcome them, but where they would find ways to survive. When the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole finally arrived in Indian territory, what is now the state of Oklahoma, they found a land that was nothing like the one they'd been forced to leave. The federal government had promised fertile soil, safety from further encroachment, and permanent ownership of their new homes. But those promises, like so many before, would prove fragile. The land was unfamiliar, the climate harsher. For many, it was difficult to grow crops or rebuild homes using traditional methods. Winters were bitter and unpredictable. Summer droughts scorched the earth. Communities were scattered, with many families arriving months apart or not at all. Diseases followed them: cholera, smallpox, influenza. Grief lived in every new settlement. The government aid that was promised livestock, tools, food, and money often arrived late or not at all. Corruption plagued the system. Contractors cut corners, supplies were spoiled, and resources meant to help resettled families start over were siphoned off by middlemen or bureaucrats with little oversight. Worse still, the land that had been guaranteed as a permanent Indian homeland was soon under threat. A reminder of injustice, of resilience, and of the strength it takes to carry a people forward when the world turns against them. Because even in the face of betrayal and exile, the people walked forward and they did not vanish. They endured. The route that once echoed with footsteps of grief now serves as a sacred path of remembrance. Across the United States, monuments, trails, and museums mark the journey. The Trail of Tears National Historic Trail, designated by Congress in 1987, stretches over 5,000 miles across 9 states, tracing the paths taken by those who were forced to march westward. It winds through forests, fields, and quiet towns, inviting visitors to walk, if only for a moment, in the footsteps of those who endured it. But true remembrance goes beyond monuments. For the descendants of those who walked the trail, memory lives in community, language, and ceremony. Tribal nations continue to honor their ancestors through annual memorial rides, storytelling gatherings, and language revitalization programs. What was once a story nearly silenced is now reclaimed and spoken with pride. Schools now teach it. Films portray it. Authors and poets give voice to the sorrow and strength of that era. And Native youth grow up knowing that their identity is rooted in more than survival. It is rooted in courage, resistance, and continuity. Yet there is still work to do. The Trail of Tears stands as a challenge to how history is told and remembered. It asks us to confront the cost of expansion, the cruelty behind policy, and the ongoing struggles faced by indigenous peoples. It reminds us that progress without humanity is not progress at all. It is erasure. To honor the Trail of Tears is to do more than look back. It is to listen, to learn, and to uplift the voices that once were pushed aside. It is to recognize that the story of America is incomplete without its native nations, not just in the past, but in the present, and in every chapter yet to come. As settlers pushed westward and the borders of U.S. states crept closer, new pressures emerged. Railroads began to carve through the land. Treaties were rewritten or ignored under pressure or manipulation. What had been set aside as sovereign territory began to shrink once again. Despite these hardships, the nations worked to rebuild. The Cherokee re-established their capital in Tahlequah and rebuilt schools and institutions. The Choctaw and Chickasaw reorganized their governments. New constitutions were written, councils met, churches were built, farming resumed. Communities began to heal, not by forgetting, but by enduring. And yet, even in Indian territory, the shadow of removal loomed. Every promise made to protect their new homeland was vulnerable to the same forces that had driven them from their original lands: greed, expansion, and disregard. The land that was promised became a temporary refuge in a nation still unwilling to see native people as permanent, rightful inhabitants. Though many believed they had finally found peace, history would soon prove otherwise. The story of the Trail of Tears didn't end in Indian territory. It simply turned the page to another long chapter in the struggle for survival, sovereignty, and respect. For decades after the forced removals, the Trail of Tears lived mostly in silence, spoken about in whispers, passed down through family stories, rarely acknowledged in textbooks or politics. It was a wound left open, a shared pain carried quietly by native communities, too often ignored by the nation that had caused it. Yet the memory survived. In Cherokee homes, elders told the story of the march west of the cold, of the hunger, of the lost. Songs were sung in mourning. Ceremonies were held in remembrance. Oral history kept the names of those who walked and those who did not alive. The land remembered too. Old trails, shallow graves, and surviving documents marked the route like a scar across the heart of a continent. It was not just a trail of sorrow. It was a trail of survival. The resilience shown by native nations after removal defied the expectations of those who had tried to erase them. In the decades that followed, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, And Seminole would not only rebuild, they would thrive. They formed new governments, ran schools, printed newspapers, and preserved languages and spiritual traditions. Against the odds, they endured. Still, the silence from outside their communities remained. Not until the late 20th century did wider America begin to reckon, even faintly, with the tragedy of the Trail of Tears. Activists and tribal leaders worked to reinsert the story into national memory. Memorials were erected. Commemorative trails were marked. School curriculums were slowly updated. The phrase Trail of Tears became a recognized term not just among historians, but in the national consciousness. But acknowledgement is not the same as justice. The effects of removal are still felt. The disconnection from ancestral lands, the historical trauma, and the legacy of broken promises continue to shape the realities of Native communities today. Yet through every hardship, the strength of these nations endures. The same spirit that guided them through forests, across rivers, and into exile still lives on in language revival programs, cultural preservation efforts, and the stories told around fires and kitchen tables. The Trail of Tears is not just about what was lost. It's about what was carried forward: faith, memory, and the unyielding will to survive. Today, the Trail of Tears is remembered not only as a historical event, but as a living memory. And so we remember not just with sorrow, but with deep respect. A minister's wife was accused. Entire families were locked in cells. The colony had lost its grip on reason, consumed by the very evil it sought to destroy. Fear was now Salem's true ruler, shaping justice, warping memory, and silencing dissent. What began as a handful of strange afflictions had become something far more terrifying, a society devouring itself one accusation at a time. The sick were left unattended, many succumbing to fever or infection. Families were forced to pay for the food and chains that bound their loved ones. Some prisoners remained confined for months after the trials had ended, forgotten or abandoned in the wake of fading panic. As summer gave way to the crisp chill of autumn in 1692, the Salem witch trials reached their darkest depths. Families of the accused spoke openly, demanding their voices be heard. One pressed to death, over 100 imprisoned, dozens more traumatized, reputations shattered, families left in ruin. Though the panic had receded, its impact remained, like smoke that hangs long after a fire. One of the most powerful acts of contrition came from Judge Samuel Sewall. They claimed they had acted in good faith, even as the horror of their decisions settled over the community. She was no longer a frightened child, but a young woman, aware of the terrible weight her words had carried. Monetary compensation was granted to their surviving relatives, though it could never repay what had been lost. Not all names were cleared. Not all wounds were healed. But it was a beginning. She confessed publicly that she had been deceived by Satan, and acknowledged that her accusations had led to the deaths of innocent people. Her apology named victims. It asked not just for divine forgiveness, but for the forgiveness of the families she had wronged. But the growing consensus, especially among the clergy, was that grave mistakes had been made. Cotton Mather himself, who had once supported the court's methods, later softened his stance in his writings. On a cold January day in 1697, during a public day of fasting and prayer, he stood before the congregation at Boston South Church. In full view of the assembled townspeople, he accepted his share of the blame. He begged God for forgiveness and asked his fellow citizens to judge him with mercy. And over time, Salem became a symbol not of righteousness, but of what can happen when fear overwhelms reason, when the pursuit of purity turns into persecution, and when justice is replaced by hysteria. The reckoning had begun, but as history so often shows, full justice would remain just out of reach. It was a rare and solemn gesture, a public act of repentance that few others dared to follow. But the legacy of the witch trials endures etched into American memory not as a tale of sorcery, but as a grim warning about the power of fear, the fragility of justice, and the danger of unchecked belief. The very phrase Salem witch trials has come to symbolize mass hysteria, false accusations, and moral panic. It is invoked in courtrooms, classrooms, and political speeches as a cautionary tale proof of how easily reason can be overwhelmed by suspicion, and how quickly a community can turn on its own. Today, Salem embraces its history, but not without complexity. Museums, memorials, and guided tours draw visitors from around the world. The Salem Witch Trials Memorial, dedicated in 1992 on the 300th anniversary of the trials, features 20 granite benches, each inscribed with the name of one of the executed. They do not list their crimes, because there were none. Only names, dates, and final words testaments to dignity in the face of injustice. Yet even now, Salem's story is more than just tourism or folklore. It is a reflection of human nature. The trials. The courts had changed, but it would take months, even years, for the final prisoners to walk free, and longer still for the town to face its guilt. Yet in that quiet autumn, the screaming ceased, the gallows stood silent, and Salem, ashamed and weary, was forced to reckon with the truth. It had not been witches that ruled them. It had been fear. Towns surrounding Salem watched with alarm, distancing themselves from what had once been a shared moral crusade. The trials had ended, but the echoes of accusation, betrayal, and execution lingered in every home and church pew. A silence hung over the town, and beneath it, a deep unease. The pressure mounted. And so, in October 1692, Governor William Phips responded. He disbanded the court of Oyer and Terminer, the body responsible for the trials, and replaced it with a new court that explicitly rejected spectral evidence. The shift was dramatic. Of the remaining prisoners, most were found not guilty. Many who had been sentenced were granted reprieves. The executions stopped. The fear did not. What had started as whispers in a minister's home had ended in blood, fear, and silence. The shift did not begin with the courts or the ministers, but rather in the still uncertain hearts of the people. Reverend Increase Mather, a leading figure of the church and father of the influential Cotton Mather, gave a sermon that reverberated through the colony. He declared, "It is better that 10 suspected witches should escape than one innocent person be condemned." The words echoed like a bell through the halls of judgment. It was not only a plea for justice, it was a condemnation of the very foundation on which the trials had been built. Doubt crept in like a cold wind beneath the door. It began with the executions of deeply respected citizens like Rebecca Nurse and John Proctor. If such upright, devout individuals could be condemned as witches, who among them could be safe? The accusations no longer targeted the fringe. They reached the core of the community. Martha Corey, a woman of strong character and faith, was condemned. Even Lady Mary Phips, the wife of the colonial governor, was accused. The hysteria had begun to threaten not only the poor and the odd, but the influential and powerful. Though the gallows would soon go quiet, the damage to Salem's soul had already been done. The gallows on Proctor's Ledge, once an anonymous rise, became a grim and ever-present silhouette on the horizon, a place of ritual executions where the final cries of the condemned were swallowed by the silence of final judgment. Many died with words of Scripture on their lips, offering prayers not for themselves alone, but for those who had condemned them. Their bodies were not granted proper burials. As convicted witches, they were denied rest in churchyards, their souls barred from the sanctity of holy ground. Some were laid in shallow, unmarked graves. Others were quietly reclaimed by grieving family members under the cover of darkness, taken home for secret burials in unblessed earth. But the most harrowing death was not by hanging. Giles Corey, an 81-year-old farmer and the devoted husband of accused witch Martha Corey, refused to enter a plea at his trial. By staying silent, He hoped to protect his land from being seized by the colony. In response, authorities ordered a gruesome punishment, pressing. Giles was stripped, placed on the ground, and slowly crushed beneath heavy stones. For 2 days, he endured the unthinkable. His lips remained sealed. His final words, according to legend, were not a plea for mercy, but a defiant command. More weight. He died without ever speaking his guilt or innocence. His resistance became a haunting symbol of the madness that had overtaken Salem. These executions were carried out in public, meant to serve as grim warnings to the rest of the colony. Entire communities came to witness the hangings. Some stood in solemn silence, faces drawn with horror. Others came with unsettling curiosity, treating the spectacle with a morbid air. One by one, the convicted were led to the wooden scaffold, bound at the wrists, often whispering prayers or singing psalms. When the trap doors dropped, another life ended, not in the name of justice, but in the name of fear parading as righteousness. In total, 19 people were hanged as witches, 14 women and 5 men. Every one of them maintained their innocence. Inside the cold, damp jails, those who had not yet been executed faced conditions that defy imagination. Pregnant women gave birth in filthy straw-lined cells. By the time the last leaves of autumn began to fall, Salem had executed more people for witchcraft than any other community in American history. By the end of September 1692, the fever that had consumed Salem began to lose its hold. It was at this fragile moment that a voice of reason rose from within the Puritan hierarchy. Others followed his lead. Ministers who had once supported the trials now urged caution. Still, the weight of the trials lingered. 19 hanged. When the final prisoners were released in 1693, Salem was left with more than empty cells. It was left with guilt. In the years that followed, many of those who had taken part in the trials began to seek redemption. Some judges and accusers held their silence, refusing to acknowledge any wrongdoing. In 1706, Ann Putnam Jr., one of the earliest and most vocal accusers, came before her church congregation. In 1711, nearly 2 decades after the first hangings, the Massachusetts legislature passed a bill to restore the civil rights of many of those convicted. Generations would grow up in the long shadow of the trials. More than 3 centuries have passed since the gallows stood in Salem. Reveal how fear can become contagious, how power can be abused in the name of morality, and how justice can falter when guided by emotion rather than evidence. The Salem witch trials are not merely a story of the past. They are a mirror held up to every age, reflecting how swiftly suspicion can spread, how swiftly communities can unravel. He reminded his audience that witch hunts do not always involve witches, and that the most dangerous trials are not always conducted in courtrooms. They may unfold in classrooms. The descendants of both the accused and the accusers still reside in Massachusetts and across the United States. It formally exonerated the final 5 victims who had not yet been legally cleared. They remind us that truth must be defended, even when fear shouts louder, and that the gravest injustices can occur not in moments of darkness, but under the full light of day. With this act, the long process of legal redemption came to a close. All those once condemned were now recognized as innocent. It was a symbolic gesture, one that came too late for those who had suffered, but not too late to remind the living of their duty to justice. Some carry ancestral shame, passed down like a shadow through generations. Others speak with quiet pride, holding on to the strength and resilience of those who stood silent against injustice, who died proclaiming their innocence rather than confess to a lie. The story remains personal to many, etched not just in history books, but in family trees, in whispered stories passed from parent to child, in workplaces or on television screens cloaked in patriotic language or moral outrage. The crucible drew clear lines between past and present, between Puritans and modern politicians, showing that mass hysteria wears many faces, but always follows the same pattern: fear accusation, condemnation. In the realm of literature, Arthur Miller's play The Crucible breathed new life into the story. Written during the 1950s, at the height of the Red Scare and McCarthyism, Miller used the Puritan Panic of 1692 as an allegory for a different kind of witch hunt, one fueled by political paranoia, where accusations replaced proof and fear became a tool of control. Miller's work served not only as a dramatic retelling of Salem's trials, but as a stark warning to his contemporaries. Even now, centuries later, the legacy of the trials touches lives. In 2001, more than 300 years after the last hangings took place, the state of Massachusetts took a final step toward righting a centuries-old wrong. The Salem witch trials were brief, just over a year in length, but their lessons have proven eternal.